Good afternoon, all. I am Valerie Patterson, Clinical Professor in Public Policy and Administration and incoming Director of the African and African Diaspora Studies Program at FIU. And welcome to the Year of Dangerous Days, a presentation of the Green School and Books and Books series, a collaboration between FIU and leading independent bookseller Books and Books. Thanks again to Mitch Kaplan and Christina Nosti for their partnership. Before we get started, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce my distinguished guests on the panel. First is Nicholas Griffin. He's a journalist, author, and previous term member at the Council on Foreign Relations. His writing has appeared in the Times, UK, the Financial Times, Foreign Policy, and other publications on topics as disparate as sports and politics, piracy, filmmaking in the Middle East, and the natural sciences. My other panelist is George F. Knox, who served as Miami City Attorney between 1976 and 1982 before entering private practice. He also served as a visiting faculty member at the Florida International University College of Law, teaching courses in negotiation and mediation. Currently maintains a private mediation practice that features relationship building, negotiation techniques. As we get started, first, Nick is going to provide an opening statement.
Sure. So thank you for tuning in. So this book basically is built around 12 months in the life of Miami, what happened in 1980, and particularly there are these three sort of overlapping disasters that come in extraordinarily short form, one after another. And those are what the New York Times called the worst race riot of the century, which I'm not sure is entirely true, but that's what they wrote in 1980. An enormous surge in immigration directed to Miami from Cuba by Fidel Castro that included camouflage, his entire prison system, and then the beginning of not only cocaine bloodshed, but more importantly for our discussion, I think cocaine money and what it did to the city. And these things sort of seem to come out of nowhere. So what I want to do for a minute before we dig in is to show or just remind people what was happening in Miami before that and where we were sort of towards the end of the 70s. Now the 70s had seen sort of some real challenges for Miami, namely a downturn in tourism, which was by far the biggest industry. It was bringing in $5 billion a year. And that was mostly because of the rise of Orlando and Disney and the arrival of cheap flights, which just bypassed Miami and people could fly straight to the Caribbean. Now, there were sort of three centers of power, I would say, at that time. There was the city government, there was the county government, and between them, there was a lot of tension. And then because of that tension, there was something called the non-group. And the non-group was a group of the wealthiest and most influential businessmen in Miami. And I say businessmen because they were all men. They weren't representative of the population. They were not a bad group of men. They were a civic-minded group of men. And I want to focus on one of them who resigns in 1973 because he's about to become mayor. And that's Maurice Ferré. And what you then have in the 70s is there's two very different paths of where Miami could go. One, which is how the non-group has been thinking and is continued to think, which is basically how to make Miami a bigger, better, more important city by looking to the north and thinking maybe we should be a bit like Jacksonville, maybe a bit like New Orleans, maybe a bit like New York. And then you have Maurice Ferré, who's now the mayor for the rest of the 1970s and into the 80s, who's Caribbean born, and he's basically thinking of a different map. The guys in the non-group are all Southerners for the most part, and they're all looking north, and Maurice Ferré is Caribbean born, and he's sort of seeing Miami as the center, not the sort of last city on the southern tip of the United States, but the center of a region that includes the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. And his drive for the rest of the 70s, he basically becomes a sort of Secretary of State for Miami, and he's endlessly touring the Caribbean and Latin America. I think he meets with 16 different presidents of Latin American nations during those times. And he does some very concrete things for Miami, such as begin the trade fair of the Americas, which shows that Miami can really be this transitional place where goods come north, money goes south, and vice versa. And then the other huge thing that he gets involved with is the passing of the EDGE Act for the banking system, which basically opens up this very provincial Florida banking system and allows banks to come in and park their money close to the action, whether those banks are from other states in America or from other nations. And those are really influential moves to drive Miami forward. So at the end of the 70s, you've got quite a lot of positive things happening, to the point where the Financial Times sends a couple of journalists over to Miami in 1979 to talk about how Miami really has become this gateway to the Americas. And there's this big shift happening where it doesn't need to look north. It doesn't need to be an important domestic city first. It can be in the very strange situation of being acknowledged as an important city by other nations, just not the nation that it actually belongs to. And I think that's key. And that was a very Maurice Ferré idea, but it's really happening. The other positive thing that's happening at that time, which seems almost impossible a month later, is that things are getting fairly progressive. They certainly don't feel that way in 1980, but they are that way in 1979. You have Maurice Ferré, who's he may be business friendly, but he's definitely a liberal mayor. He's done some very strong things in that regard. You've got a pretty liberal county manager, which is great, and you've got a pretty liberal governor, which is great. And even when there's, for instance, inside the county police force, which is something that's going to play a big part in 1980 in how Miami is seen, there had been a group of young Black officers who had all passed their sergeant's exams, and yet not one of them had received a promotion. And the sheriff at the time, the county sheriff, had often been accused of racism. And what happens, instead of sort of their issues and their concerns being disregarded, the county manager actually takes them seriously, and he fires his sheriff, and he replaces him with a guy called Bobby Jones, who declares himself as an acknowledged liberal. So all of these things seem to leave Miami in this rather positive place at the end of the 70s. And yet you have, if I was a betting man, I would have bet big on Miami in 1980. And of course, that is not how things work out. And I would say the pivot point where things really start to come undone takes place in December 1979, which is the night that a young Black motorcyclist, an ex-Marine, an insurance salesman called Arthur McDuffie, is on his way home just before 2 a.m, and he gets wrapped up in a traffic. It starts off as a traffic stop. He makes a run for it on his motorcycle to escape one cop. He ends up being followed by 15 patrol cars, and they finally get him 8 minutes later, and he pulls over his motorcycle underneath a highway bridge, and 2 minutes later, he is beaten into a coma from which he will not recover. So that's sort of the pivot point where 79 leads to 80, and all this hope and forward movement seems to come to a really, really sudden stop. So that, in a nutshell, is the 70s.
Great. So I remember being a young working mom at that point, and I remember some of the events as they unfolded. But George, you were there. You were a part of government at that point, and so I'm very interested in sort of hearing your reflections.
And what I can do is to supplement those things that Nick just talked about. For example, there was a great deal of tension between the relatively newly formed metropolitan government and the city of Miami government, for example, because underneath all of these major shifts in the governance of the community, there was a notion about the growing number and influence of so-called minority populations. There were those who said, for example, that the formation of the metropolitan form of government, which had countywide jurisdiction, was done in order to dilute the growing influence of Hispanics and Blacks inside of the city, in the core of the city, by creating a jurisdiction that is now 52 square miles and embracing the non-Hispanic, non-African American population so that their influence would be diluted. Now, there are those that can say that regional government was in fashion then, and the fact is that we don't know. What we do know is that there was a change that was being made, that there was a noble and even progressive objective. But what we don't know is the motive. And I think the value of the things that we are talking about is what was the motive? The motive, I think, was controlled and influenced in many respects by the organization called the non-group. And the non-group was effectively known as and operated as a shadow government. That the government of the city of Miami-Dade County, the economics of Miami-Dade County, and the politics of Miami-Dade County were essentially directed and managed by a small group of CEOs in the downtown business community, headed by the publisher of the Miami Herald. And so the Miami Herald, through that vehicle, would direct public opinion and shape it. And what turned out eventually was that any initiative that was conceived by the non-group became a matter of fact because of its influence over the governance and public opinion and the commerce of the community. And so there was a decision made that the question of the increasing number of Hispanics and Blacks had to be addressed. And so the community decided to address it by taking steps to integrate the institutions. And so you would see one Black member be nominated for the Orange Bowl Committee. You would see one woman nominated for the Board of Trustees of the University of Miami. You would see one Hispanic person being involved in the affairs of the non-group. And this was the idea of gradual assimilation of the minority populations into the affairs of the community by, some say, nominal appointment to positions of visibility, but little influence and power, on the one hand. On the other hand, the city of Miami became prominent, and Maurice Ferre became dominant in the view of the world because of the manner in which he carried out his duties as mayor, by his charisma and by his international aura and by his very, very intimate relationship with the Black community, for example, and identification with the things that they were saying. He became extremely popular. And when he would go to Washington, he would not be identified as a titular, unpowerful mayor of a city that's one of 27 in Miami-Dade County. He became the face and the identity of Miami-Dade County without credentials, without official portfolio. And this is a part of what made his influence so impressive, because he was operating without official portfolio. The other thing that we can point out is, again, the manner in which the media, even in the 70s, was able to influence public opinion. The events that led to McDuffie's death, for example, and someone made that point yesterday. We identified the McDuffie riot as the worst riot in the country's history. At the same time, there's a very valid statement that the McDuffie murder by police officers was the most heinous crime against an innocent citizen in the history of the United States of America. And it becomes a matter of perception and perspective. And that becomes important because, again, our reference point is one of civil disturbance and disruption and the destruction of property, when the precipitating event was not only the most heinous and brutal, but the most uncivilized act of violence that people had ever seen. And the reluctant prosecution of police officers who were present at the scene of that violence, none of whom was made or held accountable in the justice system for what they did. And so, on the one hand, there's a blasé acceptance of the events in the perception of Black people, for example, because one of the things that arose out of those events in '80 was the question of whether polarization has increased or decreased in the aftermath. And it has to do with how each of the affected populations saw those events. And so in this conversation, I know more about that than I do about immigration, even though I was involved in that, than I know about the influence of drug money, but I was present while that was going on. And so the important thing from my perspective is to have people appreciate the complexity and depth that was underlying all of the events that took place in 1980.
Thank you. Thanks. And so, yeah, for me, it's your reflections made me think about, again, that there are so many elements that I would love to touch and address. But this idea of, when you talked about the non-group and then Mayor Ferre, that this notion of representative government, right? And so the non-group is appointing people, one individual to make certain committees, whether it's Orange Bowl or whatever, more diverse, and the sense that the public may not have been aware of the existence of the non-group. I know I only learned of the non-group within the last maybe 10 or 12 years of my life as an academic. So this notion of the non-group versus the Mayor Ferre in his actually his policy making that led to this more increased, what I would call more progressive and representative government then. So there's that. And then this idea after because I've read the Your Dangerous Days and have reflected a lot about what I recall, and I've said this before, sort of past this prologue, and this idea that as we look back on the McDuffie riots, that this Mills law, where you stand depends on where you sit, that the polarization and the impact of who you were, where you were at that time, and this seemingly many times more focus on the damage. And I'm not saying that the deaths, I'm not saying that the destruction of property were not important, but this thinking about the circumstances that led to the response. And I think that you alluded to that in your reflections just now, George. So for me, it's again asking both you and Nick to think about the relations, the intergovernmental relationships, looking across levels of government. So this idea of county versus city versus state versus federal, that how much that dysfunction, if you will, exacerbated the situation as it unfolded after the decision, and then how much it exacerbated the difficulties of the city recovering.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, you see that dysfunction across the board as Miami deals with these three crises. They can do it, for instance, with when it comes to immigration, and you get this sudden surge, which no one's really prepared for, because when Fidel Castro starts the Mariel boat lift, he's not negotiating with Jimmy Carter. He calls Cuban Americans and invites them directly to Mariel. So when the boat lift starts, and within, I think it's within 3 days, you've got 1,500 boats that have gone from Key West down to Mariel, and the numbers that start coming in to surprise everybody. So the feds are definitely not ready for it. The very first people to react are the city of Miami. City of Miami gets overwhelmed very, very quickly and needs county help. So together you get this extraordinary local response. And then FEMA has just been formed the year before, and suddenly FEMA's thrown on top of it. And FEMA wades in, I'm afraid, in a really crass way, basically telling city and county that they've done a terrible job when they've been solely responsible for 8,000 people arriving a day, where they've had to open the Orange Bowl to try and deal with these numbers. And then you've got President Carter at the top of the pile, who's saying, I mean, one US Customs guy told me that at first it looked like it was policy of the week, then it seemed like policy of the day, and then finally it was policy of the hour. They just didn't know. Carter was changing his mind left and right. So you can imagine how that echoes all the way down to the Coast Guard and the customs agents. So that's on immigration level, yes, it began off as a total mess. Then I think on the cocaine money level, you can see not such a different thing. Although there was hope at the beginning of the year, because there's this. Feds do a very good job at the beginning of the year realizing that there's this huge problem centered in Miami, because the numbers were so extraordinary that the alarm bells rang at once and they had to act. Because normally a federal region in 1979 should have had about $100 million surplus or deficit. And then suddenly you've got this $7 billion surplus coming out of South Florida, which is as if an industry has arrived overnight that's bigger than Florida's largest industry, tourism, because it's 7 billion instead of 5 billion, yet this industry just didn't exist the year before. And everyone's trying to figure out what this industry is, and the feds quickly figure out that it has to be cocaine. And they do send down a group of 12 guys, including 6 armed IRS accountants, who are trying to piece together how this is working and where it's come from. So you have to give the feds credit for that. Unfortunately, again, you see this interagency problem, because this gang of people who've arrived to figure this out is supposed to consist of customs, IRS, FBI, and DEA, and DEA and FBI don't even show up. They never show up to the meetings. They don't show up till much, much later in the year when they're busy enough as it is dealing with their own cases, and they don't really have agents to spare, but they don't have the budget either, and so they don't show up. And of course, there's complete distrust between governmental agencies and local agencies, because cocaine money, the numbers are so extraordinary that the very first place to get corrupted is the county homicide department. So that means the federal agents do not trust the local agents whatsoever. So again, you could have had this quick reaction, and as you're chasing the money, you could also chase the bloodshed. And of course, there was a node between those two. But that doesn't even begin to happen to the end of the year, and it doesn't even, when it does happen, it doesn't stay happening for long. So as you said, there's the way we've constructed not only Miami as far as county, non-group, and and city goes, but as far as American agencies are concerned, we didn't form a response coherently or quickly for either of those issues.
If we again explore history, and I'm no historian, but it's hard for me to ever recall the sheer number of people who descended on the United States of America, escaping what they perceived to be and what was a tyranny that justified their escape and justified their acceptance and embrace by America based upon what America stands for. And you had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people coming all at once. And so again, we're in this, some people will expand the definition of pandemic. We're in this pandemic situation relative to a set of circumstances that nobody ever envisioned when they were establishing their own jurisdiction, their own territorial powers, and their ability to cope and to manage with unforeseen circumstances. So again, Miami was hit with everything at one time and people had no idea to deal with it. And the first impulse is generally, how does it affect me and the status quo and the system by which I have been living and governed? And that becomes, as we have seen, that was the beginning of the anti-Cuban sentiment that was likewise pervasive in Miami because of the threat that that large number of people speaking a different language really represented. And so there were no institutions that were inbred or built in to deal with that influx. And the same is true of money and all of the crime and activity that's associated with money. And so on the one hand, you had people like Maurice Ferre trying to make this an international money center for reasons unrelated to trade and not the drug trade, who's advocating, inviting the establishment of institutions. And then you have the largest bank in the South opposing that because they want all the depositors, and they either had to pretend they didn't know the source of the money, or they had to refuse to accept the money and watch their competitors grow. And that's a pretty difficult position to be in. Ergo, one would argue, the silence from traditional downtown capital-based, benevolent and community conscious people whose institutions are now not only impacted, but whose institutions are also being tempted to participate in something that they know or have good reason to believe is illicit.
Right. So I want to, before I just sort of move away from dysfunction and pathology, this is an area that I focus on in my teaching in government organizations. And so it's clearly bureaucracies work best when actions are predictable, right? That this structure works best when actions are predictable. And so before we move on with the questions, what government actors were able to respond in a nimble way, or were there any government actors that were able to respond in a nimble way during these multiple crises that were impacting the city?
Well, I think if we break it into three again, if we break it into race, immigration, and drugs, I would say in race, as far as I know, the answer was no. The attempts by Maurice Ferre and Governor Bob Graham to raise enough money to rebuild the parts of town that had been burned down during the riots were all shot down in Tallahassee because Tallahassee viewed that as rewarding rioters. And I think they were asked for $291 million to rebuild, and I think they received $8 million, and there are a lot of strings attached to those $8 million. So I think there you say definitely no. Immigration, I say there was an extraordinary effort by Cuban Americans themselves to take care of their own, especially at the beginning of the boat lift. That was undone somewhat once there was this realization that Castro had smuggled in the prison population, because obviously that changed not just Miami's opinion of Cuban Americans, but very unjustly America's opinion of Cuban Americans. And it became a real hot potato for the US government and for Carter during a election year. And FEMA, as I said, was pretty ham-handed. So I think maybe you'd give them a C for their response to the Mariel boat lift. And then on drugs, I think, they had tried, but, they couldn't beat the DEA and the FBI to be part of Operation Greenback, which don't get me wrong, Operation Greenback is tremendously important. And that's the way they start identifying how cocaine money moves in and out of America. And, there are no anti-money laundering laws that exist at this point in America. Mm-hmm. And those are actually all become written by Greenback agents who were in the field in Miami in 1980. So this is a really important learning curve. But as we all know, it's not easy to get legislation passed in Congress or the Senate. So this takes time. So I think it's another 5 years. They just don't, they may have the energy and they may have the smarts, but they don't have the tools yet to do what they should be doing. So they're very lucky. The case I follow in this book is of a money launderer called Isaac Catan, who's laundering $250 to $300 million a year for both Cali and Medellin. And they get very lucky with him, because had they got him for what they were hoping to get him for, he would have got a maximum of 5 years, which was, the equivalent of money laundering. But they actually found him with cocaine in the back of his car, which meant that, he got put away for 20 years. But that was just good luck. But thanks to that, they could interview him, they could put a lot of pressure on him, they could figure out how the whole business worked, and then they could start building legislation around this. So, I would give them a B for combating drugs, and then of course it quickly goes downhill. And as we know, drugs are still a huge issue in America 40 years later.
No, and to be as precise as I can to respond to your question, Dr. Pearson, the organization of government in Miami-Dade County, as it relates to the crises that it's presented with, is solely based upon a perception of the needs or desires of the constituents and the power of government to reform or reshape itself in response to a demand by constituents, or to avoid and resist a demand from constituents that the politicians or elected officials don't desire to service, is a real tension. For example, there are those who say that the last place that you want single member districts is in a school system, that the distribution of resources and the implementation of education policy was specifically reserved to the state and not localized. And therefore, school board elections are allegedly nonpartisan. But because of a fear of being overwhelmed by a public opinion that the sitting school board members, for example, didn't necessarily agree with, they presented to the people a device to create single-member districts in the school system. And so the device of having spheres of influence that are primarily responsive to friends and neighbors, so to speak, led to the carving up of all units of government and quasi-government in Miami-Dade County by the creation of single-member districts. At the same time, the only way that a Black would ever get elected to any public office, citywide or countywide, was ruled out. And therefore, if there needed to be representation, then that representation had to be assured by creating single-member districts. And the argument goes on about the extent to which single-member districts gave representation, but denied colleagues from being concerned about what my district needs or wants. and I have no ability to mobilize a coalition in order to get what I want because I have no power to influence what my colleagues want. So in a macro, again, if we look at motives, it all has to do with the formation of public opinion that is responsive to either pressure to be avoided or a desire to avoid pressure by creating an impossibility of being affected by that pressure. And to go back to the book, for example, all of these things are operating simultaneously. And so all of a sudden, how are we going to stop the Cuban influence? And when it happens, how are we going to accommodate them without disturbing what we're really all about? And so who are we going to embrace? And aren't they louder and don't they create a bigger threat than blacks do? And this is the opinion of many blacks. And therefore a choice was made. And so the dominant culture at that time, again, in government, in politics, and in commerce was the so-called white business community. And there's evidence that given a choice, blacks could be further marginalized if Cubans could be assimilated into the status quo. And so underneath all these decisions about federal intervention and contribution of resources and it's your problem are all related to how you're going to deal with your population being increased by more than 100,000 people over essentially a very short period of time. And I might say, many of these same questions are being posed right now in connection with who is responsible for the management of the COVID virus.
Yeah. Exactly. As I was reading the book, there are some passages, you know, when FEMA was discussed, I was like, oh, FEMA again. And then the other day I was reading something, reading a passage where I that discussed response and I wrote COVID-19. I mean, it sounds just like the sort of COVID-19 response on the federal level. And so for me, it's really, again, going back to Mayor Ferre, that he utilized a collaborative model. It based on what I read, and based on what I recall. As I mentioned, my mother. I was having this discussion with my mother the other day, and she mentioned how at Christ Church they would see him very frequently. So he was well known in the Black community. He was perceived as a champion of Black Miamians because of the naming of the first, right? And I think George, you were a part of that. And so actually I want to stop and you came from Jacksonville to become city attorney. Was that it?
Yeah, well, it was a long trip. I grew up in Jacksonville. I went away to school. I went to the Army. I attended the University of Miami Law School.
Oh, okay.
And my first job was in the office of the city attorney. And while I was, and then I went away to teach and I was identified. I came in contact with the city and came to the attention of the mayor and members of the commission. And that's how I eventually got appointed, and that was in 1976. And again, that triggered a whole new wave of looking at the racial and ethnic and gender integration of the city's workforce. I want to say a thing before I ask Nicholas to reply to your question, and that is, in context, again, Maurice Ferre was a wealthy Puerto Rican who had to be accepted or tolerated by the so-called powers that be in that time because of his wealth. And when he became mayor, he used his influence from that perspective as leverage in order to do those things that he believed in as it relates to questions of equal access, equal opportunity, and equal rights. And he maintained his position because he then used that same access to the voting population to leverage popularity across enough sectors that he was virtually unbeatable until the Cuban population grew to the point that it was 50% plus one, greater than a combination of any other coalition. And the domination began along ethnic lines. Whether willful or not, the fact is that Maurice Ferré is famous for saying that there'll never be anybody other than a Cuban person elected to any public office in Miami-Dade County, and demographics bear that out until we have a condition where ethnicity is less significant in terms of people's decision making. But the value of the book is that it is the first publication of credible information that has escaped, I'll call it the censorship of the local community, who for years and years and years would not support or embrace any revelation of the conditions that existed in the city of Miami during this most tumultuous period.
Yeah, I would add, just to talk about what Ferré was up to then, and how he sort of survived in office. If you think about the beginning and the end of 1980, you're basically living in two different cities as far as the influence of votes and the demographics go. Because at the beginning, you've got Cuban Americans are just not really involved in local politics. They're involved in international politics to the nth degree. You know, the demands to remove Fidel Castro are extremely strong at the beginning of 1980, and the voices reach up to the White House. But they're registered to vote at only 17%. So they don't really have a huge sway. It's still, Maurice Ferré is relying on this sort of black and white and Latin, he's got a sort of amazing power to sort of sit between all of those communities and interact with them. And he does it extremely well. He calls himself, or at least he called himself to me, a bad politician many times, but that's utter rot. He was obviously an excellent politician to be reelected so many times and to ride these changing demographics. But then what you get in the middle of 1980, once Mariel has begun and, local Miami feels betrayed by Castro sending his prison population, and you get this anti-Cuban feeling. You get middle class and white a call to rescind the idea that the law that Miami is a bilingual city, a bilingual county. So this is a really, I think they need 30,000 votes to put it on the ballot, and I think it gets 130,000 votes. So when it succeeds on the ballot in November, and Miami is, in theory, no longer a bilingual city, then the Cubans feel very much betrayed by this. They're like, hang on a second, we've done an awful lot for this city in the 20 years we've been here, no matter what's happened in 1980. And you get this slap in the face from the white community, who not only deliver this slap in the face, but a lot of them move, and you get this white flight north. So suddenly you get this change in Cuban attitudes towards domestic voting. So by the time Ferré faces the next election in 1981 in November, he suddenly has 6 Cuban American challengers for his job. That just wouldn't have happened 2 years before that. So that's a huge change. So he's riding a totally different wave within one year from the one he was riding the year before. But it makes Miami that you have this incredible triangulation of race and change in such a short period of time.
So for me, the next question that occurs to me, especially as an academic, and it's a question that I raise with my students all the time, and I ask them to respond. It's and looking back, based on the evidence that is presented, based on the information, the data that is available, what are the lessons learned for where we are right now in this city? What are the lessons? What are the lessons? What are the takeaways? I'll rephrase that. What are the takeaways? And have lessons been learned from the year of dangerous days?
Shall I start, George, and then I'll hand it over to you?
Please.
I would say drug-wise, the lessons that were learned in Miami were important, but it did turn into a game of whack-a-mole. That you know, the amount of dollars involved was so vast that industry was never going to go away. It could be relocated, which is what happened. You slammed down hard on South Florida between 80 and 82, and suddenly it pops up in Texas and California. So in that regard, there were no great, lessons learned, or rather no cure was found. On immigration, I think, obviously the Mariel population who arrived, they had a tough time. They had a really tough time leaving Cuba. Castro was calling them scum and filth, and they lost everything, and those that didn't make it out were caught in this sort of limbo. They had a tough time on arrival, and then they had a tough time assimilating because they weren't, by the end of 1980, they were sort of radioactive even to their own community, because they were associated with these 4,000 Cuban prisoners who came along with them. Have we changed immigration laws? Yes, we have. Actually, the weird thing is that Mariel starts the week after Ted Kennedy passes his huge immigration law, and it's totally ineffective a week later after Mariel begins. It just doesn't foresee the circumstances of Mariel. So I think it shows that there's always holes in immigration policy. We certainly haven't got an effective immigration policy now. I think both sides would agree on that one. And then race. I mean, you only have to look at poverty within Dade and Miami to realize where that poverty still exists are the very same neighborhoods that were on fire in 1980. That problem has not been solved. So, here we are, we're talking about the same things 40 years later. It makes you wonder that maybe we should have just slowed down and properly addressed these issues when they were happening, so that we didn't have to go through all of this again and again. George?
Yeah. Well, all right, let's start with race, and leading up to 80 and beyond. Up to 1980, there was a growing affinity between the Black and newly developing Cuban communities. We were both legally identified as minorities, and therefore the benefits that were made available by virtue of the minority status was gleefully shared. We began to form relationships and even business connections until the tension of making a choice came about. And again, one could argue that Blacks were victims of a choice. On the one hand, there's this natural affinity between formerly oppressed people who share the misery of oppression and come together by virtue of it. And on the other hand, there's this invitation that if you will renounce that affinity, then if you will assimilate, then there's a place that can be made for you. And the story that I always tell was a story that I heard, and was an argument between two civic leaders that took place around 1980. One of them said, I learned, or my family never knew about racism until we came to America, and our mentors, tutors, and guides introduced us to the idea and told us that if we could continue to treat the Black community as consumers, then we have a no recourse source of revenue and well-being for ourselves. The minute they become empowered, then they become a threat. The other member of that conversation said, "Oh no, my family always knew that the Cuban society was biased against dark-skinned Cubans. And so racism existed even in Cuba, so we didn't inherit it when we came here, we brought it with us." I'm being a little bit cynical, but that's the bottom line. The point is that as much polarity, for whatever reason, existed between blacks and Cubans in the aftermath of 1980 appears to still exist right now. And so the lesson learned is that something other than our natural affinity based upon genetics and demographics and a knowledge of history is not sufficient to bind us, because our interests are so different. And the interest in the American capitalist focus is one that is shared by all in terms of the interest, but the resources are not shared by all, because some are included and some are excluded from access. And the other thing that happened is that the banking system and the systems that use money are in a position to regulate themselves, because money is so plentiful now that it's not necessarily to depend exclusively upon bad money in order to succeed. But Miami is still identified as a demilitarized zone, where people who are involved in whatever organized crime may be can freely operate here without competing with each other and without being beat down by enforcement agencies for so long as you follow the law. And so the same identity of Miami as being a free trade zone for good and bad, and being a demilitarized zone for bad people to coexist, there's still remnants of that identity even as we speak.
So how do we overcome and move beyond that perception, possibly reality? So what are your expectations for the future of Miami?
Go ahead, Nick.
Well, I don't, I would say I'm only effective in the past. But for the future, one would hope for better leadership. It's not easy the way the very system that we live in, it seems to be designed to clash. During COVID times, I think it's really obvious. I live in Miami Beach. I have one set of curfews and laws there. I drive 3 miles over the causeway, I'm suddenly in a different curfew, and then I take a left and I'm in the county curfew. How are you supposed to operate as an individual, drive 5 miles and have 3 different sets of laws? That obviously isn't effective. It would be nice to see some sort of organized way in which we could have some sort of more centralized system. I think that's probably an inevitability, but we may be talking, Miami, we're a really young city. I think we have to remember that we're less than 120, we're just around 120 years old. Right. New York's 200 years older than us or more. So, so are other American cities. So we are still figuring things out. So the idea that we're perfect so young is, perhaps an elusive one. But I think obviously there's lots of low-hanging fruit in Miami as well. Why? You look at Overtown and the positioning of Overtown just geographically. How on earth has Overtown entirely avoided the progress that's taken place all around it? I think that's low-hanging fruit. Why hasn't that been done? So, George, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I go to relationships, and the fact is that with time, each generation has a greater affinity for the different tribal interests than ever before. And so relationships that break down these historic artificial barriers are being developed. because of the moving around of people, and because younger people don't have the attitudes that existed in the 1980s about superiority, equality, and all of the fundamental things that make people get along. The other is the development of common purpose. People now have common agendas that allow them to cross cultural, racial, and gender and any other preferences in order to achieve their common purpose. And the other thing is that we must realize that we are leaderless. We should remove the expectation that there's a spokesperson for the various interests that are represented by our population. I mean, the demise of the system, the organized system of governance, which was represented by the non-group, and by the absence of a charismatic mayor who is the name and face of a community and is also accountable for his or her carrying out of their duties, is gone now to that extent. And so the idea of contribution towards a whole made by individuals is, I think, the future. And there's a hopeful future because we'll be in a position where interdependence is far more significant than assimilation into a system that no longer works.
Great, thank you. So that so it sounds like that it's a hopeful future, right? That we can look forward to. Sometimes I think it's really useful to ask this next generation leadership about the future that that they want to see, and to get them to think about their ideas for the possibilities. So as we move towards the end, I want to thank both of you for a very engaging and interesting and enlightening conversation on the year of dangerous days. It's been such very interesting reading for me. I'm looking forward to having my assigning it to my students, because I'm just very interested in their take on as a case study, right? And also want to again thank the Green School Books and Books series and the collaboration between Books and Books, an independent bookseller. Thanks again to Mitch Kaplan and Christina Nasti for their partnership. Thanks again to you, Nicholas, and thanks to you, George, for your willingness to have this conversation with me and allow me to throw these questions forward and have you give me your me and the audience your responses.
Well, thanks
Thank
for
you
the
so much.
opportunity. And
Thank you.
I hope that we'll hear a lot more from months to come.
Great.
Thank you,
Thanks
guys.
to our audience. Thank you for your participation.
And thanks to the team that kept us together. And thanks to you for your brilliant moderation, Dr. Patterson. Love to Mom.
Yeah. I'll tell her. I'll tell her. Thanks.
Thanks. Take care, and we'll meet again along the way, Nicholas.
Okay, George, I have no doubt.
Take care.
Bye.